Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the latest episode in our Keys webinar series, our monthly broadcast to our clients around the world. We're delighted to have you with us today as we address the question in hand. We're going to look at whatever happened to the new normal. We're going to pause and just have a think a little bit about the times we've been through these last few years. In fact, it's almost 4 years since we first started to see this unwelcome image of the coronavirus COVID-19. We all know what happened next with lockdowns around the world, and indeed us immediately trying to think about what this all meant with our world turned upside down. One of the other phrases that we were thinking about a lot was, what would the new normal look like? And a quick flick through Google Trends reminds us just how many people were thinking that and worrying about that around the middle of 2020. And if you look at how that line has progressed, still, it's not a topic that's completely gone away. Hence, we thought it might be a good moment to take stock. Now, thinking about the new normal, we were looking at it during 2020 in a couple of ways. There was the new normal today as we were living through the pandemic diaries as people share what their new normal is like, governments publishing frameworks on how we can cope with the new normal, or indeed navigating what the new normal means in schools, colleges, and in universities. But even then, we were starting to think about what it would be like after all this is over. What would the new normal play out like? And we asked, for example, questions around whether pandemics are going to be the new normal. Let's hope not. We were wondering whether Seattle's new normal would be very different after coronavirus was over. And indeed, there are questions around what our working lives would look like once this is all over. And we'll touch on that a little bit later on. But to help us take a tour of the territory, we've got our expert panel who we're delighted to have on the Keys stage. I'm talking to you today from London, and I'll kick off by giving you a quick overview of some of the observations we have looking at the public mood now and then. We'll then fly to Brazil, and Helena in Sao Paulo will help us understand some of the different conversations that are happening these days on some of the aspects of our lives and our business life, and put that in a little bit of context. We'll then be in Manchester with Jack, who's going to be thinking about some of the enduring lessons for leaders these days. And finally, we'll be going to Antwerp with Christina. She's traveling a lot these days, but in Antwerp today. And she's going to be helping us think about the emotional roller coaster. You'll see there's a question mark there as she asks us to think about whether it's been quite as dramatic as we might have thought. As we go through the session, please let us have any questions for our panelists. Put them in the chat box and we'll answer them either at the end or indeed following on from the webinar. All of the slides, by the way, will be available to you and we'll be sending them over tomorrow. Also watch out, a little bit later on, we're going to have a bit of a quiz. So keep an eye out for a pop-up message about halfway through our webinar. But just to kick off, the public mood now and then. And I haven't just chosen that title because it's a Beatles record just out. I've chosen it because it really is the frame in which we've been thinking about our topic today. And our starting point being that the now is often quite tricky. Month to month, things aren't always that easy to read. And we at Ipsos have been quite struck by this Economist article published earlier in the year, where they started to think about this puzzle of the world economy. Welcome to the Mona Lisa effect. And what were they talking about there? Well, it was the sense that post the pandemic, the post-pandemic economy is a bit like the Mona Lisa. Every time you look at it, you see something that little bit different. And we've been finding that a little bit in our own work. Our global consumer confidence index is also the Mona Lisa effect in many ways, because every time we look at it, we see something a little bit different. Let's start in April when that article was published. We had consumer confidence moving in opposite directions. Then it was going to its highest point in 16 months. By June, it was showing contrasting trends among the world's largest economies. In July, it's declining sharply among many European countries. By August, it was varying widely across regions again. By September, it was down across Europe again. But look, in October now, it's declining across Southeast Asia. And it serves as a reminder in the work that many of us on the call are often involved in. But although we sometimes have a front seat and we're quite close to the action, just as we might be in a sporting event, sometimes we can be perhaps a little bit too close, and we need to take a step back, perhaps move a little bit higher and think a bit about what we know, or what we can draw on some of the information that we have at hand to put that all in context. So to take just one example here, it's the trend line. Once I've got that trend line, I'm starting to be in a better place. We'll look now at the current state of the economy in 3 countries, and in each of them, the trend line helps us understand that more. Argentina's scores on the state of the economic situation in our country is, of course, very alarming. The trend line reminds us that that has been the case for a number of years, and we need to have that in mind as we seek to understand how people in that country are feeling. Similarly, we can't understand Sweden without an acknowledgement of some of the most recent changes, and the trend here on the economy is much, much more bleak than it had been in previous years. And on the US, all eyes, of course, will be on the US over the next 12 months with the election coming. The results are okay in historic terms, going back a decade or so, but certainly rather lower than they were leading into the pandemic. And that country context really is something that we really often have to drill down to if we're trying to get that more nuanced understanding. So to think about the US just a little bit more, today's context in the Biden era is that inflation is the #1 issue facing the country, according to our What Worries the World study. When we were in the Obama era, we're going back nearly 10 years, it was more healthcare and unemployment. So to have that kind of then and now context, so helpful. But as we have that context, for us charged with interpreting and sharing and communicating this kind of data, we also have to think about that story, because just using that What Worries the World data that I've been sharing with you, I could certainly draft a presentation which was all about disruption, all about the change. Look at this before COVID, those issues that people were worrying about, constant over time. Look at what happened since. The lines are getting wigglier. We had the rise of inflation. We had COVID storm onto the scene, and now decline to a position where it's now only 17 out of 18. And I absolutely could build a full presentation around the disruption, but I can also start to build one around continuity. And actually, if I take away inflation, the top 4 issues, crime and violence, poverty, corruption, and unemployment, are the same as they were prior to COVID. It's kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs: the need for security, the need for shelter, the need to have food and sustenance are still there. So that's one of the disciplines we've been trying to think about as we've gone through preparing this webinar today. Think about what's changed, but also think about what's staying the same. We've been doing that in relation to people's daily lives, starting to see trends and patterns that we can observe and talk about. We're perhaps staying in less. Netflix set to report the lowest revenue growth in 20 years. But again, we have to nuance that a little bit, because we're certainly finding people in our essentials study are saying they're cancelling subscriptions perhaps just as much because they're worried about financial or economic pressures, perhaps because they're staying in less. We are, however, seeing people going out more in recent times, and of course the problems of Peloton are well documented, and we're starting to see people saying, yeah, I am going to spend a certain amount more of my pie on going out, again from our recent essentials study. We're also seeing people traveling more. We're familiar, of course, with scenes like this during the pandemic, with planes being grounded. We're now, of course, starting to see a recovery. Question about here from our prediction study about whether people would be flying more or less than they were in 2019. Well, the jury was out at the start of the year. Certainly, they're the case that people still are flying less than they were, but we'll have to see how that pans out 2 or 3 years from now and what the new normal really looks like in that context. Another lens to look through, of course, is our working lives. Many of you may be working from home these days, at least some of the time. Doesn't take me long to find some striking data. This from the US, home-based workers more than tripled, but it's still less than 1 in 5. And it's those 1 in 5, of course, a particular type of people, more likely to be at the more affluent end of the spectrum, maybe more likely to be some of us on this call, or indeed some of the people writing about trends and all of that. And worth always reminding us that for many, many people, working from home is not an option. Even if we look at office workers, and I'm now drawing on research from Jack, who you'll hear from in a moment, and his colleagues, it's much more of a nuanced norm, as most full-time office workers, to take the UK as an example, are working for their employer's location most of the time. And we also need to think about our health, and a couple of things that we've been reflecting on as we've started to look at what the post-pandemic data is looking at. Firstly, how we feel about our healthcare system. Very much a reminder that the country context really matters as much as ever. We're always struck by how different the results from 2 neighbouring countries, perhaps with similar cultures on the face of it, similar economies on the face of it, often have rather different results when we ask questions about how people feel about their country and about their environment. And here we see big differences now. We're looking at the changes in how people rate their healthcare system, and it varies very much from country to country. One point though, and Helena will touch on this in just a moment, is around mental health. And one of the things we can be, I think, absolutely clear about as we've emerged from the pandemic is we do so with mental health more of a priority than it was before. It's now increasing in terms of the proportion of people raising that as a top issue facing their country. It's now ahead of cancer as a healthcare concern, and it does look to be one of the lasting, let's say, impacts of the pandemic. So that's my quick tour of the public mood, and you'll find links in the slides which we'll share with you later. But we wanted to go into this into a little bit more detail, and thanks to Helena and her work, we've been able to look at a bit more some of the conversations that have been happening online and a bit more about some of the changes that we're observing. So Helena, it's wonderful to have you back on the Keys stage. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon. So at the beginning of 2022, we did an edition of Keys in which I brought the topic, Are We Okay?, to talk about how the pandemic had affected our mental health, our physical health, our way of working, our way of living at that moment, with a special focus on my country, Brazil. So today I wanted to bring a reflection and some data about what has changed since then. And that's why I ask, are we already okay today after everything we've been through? So first, it's important to remember that the world is experiencing polycrisis. This is the term we use to describe the connection between different systems that enter into crisis simultaneously and feed each other back. And this is what we have seen around the world with political and economic issues, social, cultural issues, environmental changes, technological issues, digital issues. Regarding the economy, one of the main concerns we had during the pandemic was the economic insecurity and the fear of losing our jobs. And here we can see the evolution of global searches on Google for unemployment. And there was a big spike at the beginning of the pandemic, and then a downward movement in people's interest in this topic, which indicates that this large-scale insecurity is something we have already left behind, fortunately. And when it comes to remote work, we see a huge spike in March 2020 when we all have to adapt suddenly to home office. but the searches on this topic are still growing, which is interesting because people are still very interested in continuing working from home. The main searches in the past 12 months are for remote work opportunities, actually. And regarding mental health, we see these frequent spikes in October every year on International Mental Health Day. But it's very clear that there's a growing increasing in this topic because this is something that we were already observing in the past years. But it's undeniable that the pandemic brought this topic more to our agenda through the media, organizations, and brands, etc. And when there's more talk about a subject on social media and in the news, people tend to seek more information about it, which in this case is very positive. And when we look specifically at searches about anxiety, we see that the country that stood out the most is Ukraine, unfortunately. But look who is in the second place, Brazil. So we Brazilians, we are actually the most anxious country in the world, according to the World Health Organization. And this is a problem that we have already dealt with before, but it has definitely worsened with the pandemic. And in fact, Brazil is a country where mental health is a very serious problem. In this data from the Ipsos Global Healthcare Monitor, we can see that the importance of mental health is growing every year, as Simon said. But in Brazil, we are well above the global average. This is specifically serious for us here. And mental health is a problem considered bigger than cancer, than drug abuse, for example. And global warming is also something that we have had to deal with. And this very sad photo was taken recently in the Brazilian Amazon, which is suffering from river droughts and deforestation. And looking at the last 3 years, we see how Brazilians have brought the global warming more to social media. The most recent peak in conversations on social media about global warming occurred in the past quarter during our winter in Brazil, which was one of the warmest in several decades. And gender-based violence is also a serious problem for us, for the whole world. And the pandemic has increased the number of cases of domestic violence during social isolation in many countries, including Brazil. And there's a study we do in partnership with the UN Women, in which we monitor how people, and actually how normal people, common people, and the media are talking about gender violence in Brazil and some other countries. And as you can see here in this chart, when we look at local online news in recent years, there has been an increase in the importance given by the Brazilian media to this issue, especially due to some cases that, oh, sorry, my battery. Especially due to some cases that generated aggression. But this increase is also motivated by campaigns that aim to reduce gender violence. And these campaigns can bring people some optimism. In this project with UN Women, we identify the emotions that people express on social media when talking about gender violence. And I was very surprised at the beginning of this project because I was thinking how people can have positive emotions talking about violence. But soon I realized that these emotions are linked to optimism, to the relief that justice has been done in some cases, and is linked mainly to the hope that the situation may get better in the near future. So we are always optimistic in many subjects, including violence. And we cannot forget that the polycrisis is also digital. It involves privacy issues, algorithm biases, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, among many other topics, including fake news. And as you can see, Brazil is the top country that has searched for fake news on Google. And this happens because we are one of the countries with the greatest spread of fake news in the world. And according to Vote Sentinel, which is a platform that identifies fake profiles on Twitter, 25 to 30% of the bots they identify are Brazilian. This is a very serious problem for us here. And artificial intelligence has become a great interest for the whole world, especially after the popularization of ChatGPT. And that's why we see this huge growth on Google searches in the last month. And for you to understand how we are dealing with these technological changes here in Brazil, here are some comparisons with the global average on the Ipsos Views on AI survey. And on the one hand, we have a much higher level of insecurity than the rest of the world about losing our jobs. But on the other hand, we Brazilians also have much higher levels, again, of optimism and excitement regarding AI. So we believe that AI can help us optimize our time and carry out our daily tasks. And in fact, the optimism regarding AI, it's a common behavior in Latin America. As you can see, we can see in this data on expectations of improvement in the job market, the economy, and health. But as you can see in these yellow bars, the optimism rates are always higher in Brazil. So this is our characteristic. But although we are very excited about technological changes, there's a feeling of nostalgia linked to the fact that we would like Brazil to go back to the way it used to be. And this number, 61%, is not very different from the rest of the world, 60%. And maybe it happens because we feel that the world before this polycrisis, before this accelerated changes, this world of the past allowed us to live more peacefully, more confidently maybe, and it's normal for us to feel this ambiguity between the nostalgia for what was good in the past and the excitement for what will come in the future. So if you want to know more about this and know more about Brazil, I invite you to read the latest edition of Ipsos Flair. I actually have one physical edition here in my hands, but you can find it an online version in English. And the theme of this edition is nostalgia or perspectives. And I really recommend the reading. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk to you today.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you with us, Helena, and to give your perspectives, including on the nostalgia. And I'm just actually interested in that point. Actually, you're those of us based outside Brazil. I think it's our obligation to really devour that report because you're the largest country, the largest population, the largest economy. Are there any quick takeaways just before we all go away and read the report after the webinar, folks? Any quick takeaways for you that you would share, perhaps with people from outside Brazil, as we go into looking at that report in a bit more detail?
Yeah, so I recommend reading Flair because at Flair we talk about many of these crises we talked about today, and many of the topics we covered here are here on Flair. But we also have a focus on how companies can deal with these behavior changes and how companies can prepare for what consumers expect for them. So we talked a lot about transparency, purpose, companies' involvement in social issues, environmental issues. So I think these are lessons that talk a lot about Brazil, but also talk about the world today, because this is something we are expecting brands and companies to be involved with our problems, with mental health, with violence, with environmental issues, and we expect this kind of transparency from all the companies. And this is a movement. It's a big trend that we can see all over the world, and not only in Brazil.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that. And as you said, the link is in the report. And for those of us who aren't great at Portuguese, we have the English language version as well. Now, Helena, you just then mentioned the role of companies and purpose, and that actually very much connects us with our next presentation. Many of us on this call will be managing or leading teams and organizations and trying to get the right changes in place to help make a difference. And Jack, we've asked you to share with us your perspectives. And Jack is somebody who does this for a living, working with different organizations and helping to them to take the temperature. And Jack, we're really pleased to have you with us to help us learn a little bit about what you've been learning along the way in terms of how we can be better leaders. The floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Simon, much appreciated. And yes, thank you for having me. It's great to be here. And I think, so I guess the question, how can leaders navigate through this change, and what can we do to support others through it? And we've only got a short amount of time today to answer that question, so it will be a whistle-stop tour of that question. But the work we do with some of the biggest organizations in the world really equips us to be able to answer these kind of questions. And through the employee listing programs that we run, we survey around 3 million employees a year. And for the clients we work with, that gives them and their leadership teams insights and abilities to make better people decisions. But for things like this, what it does is give us a real unique and data-led view, and ability to answer questions like, what is good leadership? Or, very topical today, why are people staying or leaving their organization? Or also, how are people navigating through change? And we know from the data we've got over a slightly longer period that the way that people work through and navigate through that change follows this classic change curve. So what we can see here is employee advocacy. So that's a classic measure of overall employee experience, and it's the proportion of people who would recommend their employer as somewhere to work. And you can see that when major business transformation happens, advocacy then drops, and organizations tend to spend anywhere from 12, but more like 18 to 24 months at what we'd call the bottom of the change curve there, before a much more gradual recovery back up to pre-transformation levels over another 6, 8, 9 month period. So you can see the real kind of longitudinal effect that change has on our overall employee experience. And the issue we see is that change is never singular. So there's never one change that an organization's faced with. Just listening to some of the stuff that Simon was talking about and Helena was talking about, change is continuous. There's a lot of things happening in parallel. And what that really means is organizations, rather than moving through a change curve, they're moving through a change cyclone. Multiple instances of this change curve are happening in parallel. And Simon talked about this idea of the new normal, and we absolutely know that constant change is a critical part, whether we like it or not, but it's a critical part of that new normal. As businesses reshape, rethink, refocus in a post-COVID world and adapt to changing consumer needs, digitization, whether it's hybrid work changes, as Simon touched on in the introduction, economic uncertainty, whatever it may be, we know this is constant. So it can be really difficult actually for leaders to navigate themselves and their teams through this change. And that's what I want to spend the rest of the time today talking about, is what are the lessons that we've got, again, from the data we have, on what leaders should be doing more of to manage during these times. And another key theme of today really is actually what's changed and what's different. And we know that really these 4 things always have been important behaviours for leaders to demonstrate, but also probably always will be as well. And just before I unpack each of these in a little bit more detail, I think it's important to say that we know when these kind of behaviours are present that it really matters. Yes, both in terms of softer, more people-focused metrics, as you can see there, but also a real impact on the bottom line. So research we've done with retail stores shows us that stores where those kind of behaviours in leadership teams are prevalent, there's a much clearer impact on the bottom line there. So around a 15 to 20% uplift on bottom line metrics in places where those behaviours are more prevalent compared to the places where perhaps those behaviours are slightly less prevalent. So the first thing I'll talk around, the first lesson, is around visible leadership. And the pattern that I'll show you in a second is consistent. It's one that we know holds true across every organization in respective of size, shape, sector, whatever that focus may be. And the pattern is this: it's that more visible leadership is strongly linked to good people outcomes. And this holds true for whatever level of leader we're talking around. So if I see my direct line manager more often, that leads to better people outcomes. See my line manager less often, and that also then moves up the organizational hierarchy. So departmental leaders, chief executives, senior leadership teams, boards, whoever it may be. And you can see the huge impact and difference that has. And we also know that in a world of hybrid working and everyone battling to find that right balance, that there's still definitely a place for this communication and visibility from leaders to be done in a face-to-face way. So you can see here the impact of the communication channels that individual employees rely on and how that relates to our levels of trust in leaders. You can see that group in the turquoise on the right-hand side, really showing that there's still room for face-to-face personal interactions, on-the-ground interactions between employees and leaders than the perhaps easier to administer at the click of a button, but clearly less effective when it comes to building visibility. And as all of us, you and the organizations you work for included, are all fighting the battle of getting hybrid working, to really work for us and find the right balance. And I think it's key that it's that balance that we achieve, and a balance that leaves room for leaders to be visible in a face-to-face environment, which we know clearly is no replacement for easier to administer but less effective online channels as well. The second key thing I'll talk about is active listening. And when we say listen, what we really mean is, yes, listen, but also really hear what people are saying. And a huge disparity in the experience between people who do feel listened to by leaders and perhaps those who don't. Now, this isn't about leaders acting on every single idea or suggestion that comes forward from colleagues. That's not what we're saying. What we're really saying is people need that basic need of feeling listened to, heard, like their opinions are valued, rather than necessarily acted on every single time. And we also know that as many as a third of people in the workforce don't feel this on a day-to-day basis. So a really key lesson for leaders and things for us all to think around. Lesson 3 is all around complete clarity of purpose. Now, many organizations think they've got this thing cracked. You've got a purpose, you have a strategy, you have a mission, it's on your website, it's included in your employee handbooks, and therefore, we're done. We don't need to think about that. But actually, what we can see, the number one thing people ask their managers to demonstrate more of is going back to that purpose and going back to that goal, those goals that we set. Keep me informed as to how we're doing. How are we progressing towards those goals? That's the number one thing people want more of from the managers, and also leaders want more of that themselves. So this travels all the way up organizations, and we need to set this tone from the top and cascade those key messages of progress through an organization. And just to highlight that third point there around people wanting more quality time with the team, that goes back to that first lesson of leadership I talked around, where visibility is actually really key. And the final lesson is all around empowerment. And I think this is probably the one that is most important during times of change, because when change is happening around us, it goes against our natural human instincts. We want structure, we want order, we want influence, autonomy, and change strips a lot of those things away from us, which is why leaders truly empowering their teams is really powerful during times of change. And you can see here the difference between teams who do feel that sense of empowerment versus teams who don't feel that sense of empowerment. And you can see it in terms of the number of ideas they generate, but also the experience of agile and quick decision making, which we see as a major blocker on the day-to-day basis for people in large, complex, matrix structured organizations, many of which I'm sure you're all part of. So I said it would be a whistle-stop tour, and I think it's absolutely been that. And these aren't huge brand new ideas or big, complex, difficult to implement ideas. They're designed to be simple, practical things that leaders and us can, in our roles as leaders, can do. So I'd encourage each of you to think around, in the next 24 hours, perhaps in the next week, which one of these can I demonstrate more of? And also thinking around the organizations that you're part of, how prevalent are each of these behaviors, and perhaps what could be done to increase the prevalence of them. Simon, back to you.
Well, Thank you for that, Jack. And you've got me thinking already. So you're telling me I shouldn't just put something on the intranet and that will be fine?
Yes, I hope that's not new news, but yes.
No, it was good to see the reminder though, that because perhaps all of us maybe occasionally tick the box, and that box might not be the one to tick. And that's one thing I just might want to draw on before we go and talk to Christina. You gave us those four takeaways that we should be thinking about. Are there any that you find organisations are particularly, let's say, prone to neglect?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I would probably say empowerment. The last one I talked around, in that the world of work is pressurized, and I think is becoming more pressurized in a difficult economic environment. And what we tend to see in that scenario is leaders almost move into that command and control kind of way of operating and way of leading, where it's a very directive leadership style to not only set out what needs to be done, but set out how that needs to be done as well. And that doesn't always leave room for that sense of autonomy and buy-in and empowerment that clearly we know we all as humans kind of crave, but that also gets better outcomes as well, by empowering people to deliver an outcome rather than follow a series of steps.
Well, thank you. Thank you for all of that advice. And you mentioned the word humans, which I know is a theme of our next presentation. So we're going to move from one city with terrible weather, Manchester, to another city with terrible weather, Antwerp. Christina, I know you've been traveling, and that's actually affected and infused your presentation. So take it away as we think about the new flow and the new normal. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Simon. Hi, everybody. Happy to be with you. Yes, I'm just back from Mexico, where we have celebrated Day of the Dead in the Mexican style with parties and flowers and color. And I want to use this metaphor because it's very good to understand that as humans, we do have our natural coping mechanism to look at a crisis by holding on to what is really meaningful. This is why I will be sharing with you today this deeply human point of view, the universal human motivations. We're talking, of course, about Sensidium, which a lot of you in the audience are familiar with. Sensidium is the Ipsos practice dedicated to investigating those deep human motivations, the ones that are fundamental and stable and quite resilient to change. And many of you use it as a consumer centricity compass in your brand positioning, in your innovation, in your communication. But a reminder of what are the 8 fundamental human motivations is always welcome. So I would like to invite you now to experience them personally. And I propose an interactive game for everyone. Take your phone, scan this QR code on the screen, and take the quiz to find your personal superpower. How do you find resilience during these times? And for the ones of you who cannot scan the QR code, my colleagues will help us with the link in the chat. So you can just click on it and get your outcome, your personal superpower, your Sensidium color, we call it, and do put it in the Q&A for us or in the chat. Both work perfectly. For us all to share and to see what is your superpower, because the normal and the new normal are not something that just happen out there to the world, to our consumers or patients or users. They happen to us too. And the new normal affects how we make decisions and how we live our lives. So looking forward to seeing your colors or your superpowers in the chat. Thank you. And while you do that, I bet you want to know how your superpowers fit into the framework of how these 8 fundamental human motivations look like in the world with our consumers. So I'm looking forward to seeing your color. And in the meantime, I'll share with you, happy to oblige, how these 8 fundamental human motivations have been playing out in the past year. So what you see here in the yellow line is how they look like in September 2023. And in the white line, how our key fundamental human needs were playing out in September 2020. And you will see that not a lot has changed. The same 3 needs, so you see 3 spikes, right? And they all come out both in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic crisis and in 2023. The ones of you who have discovered the yellow color, we call it the networker, this is one of the 3 spikes coming out with our consumers too around the world, which is the need to stay optimistic and positive. For the ones of you who have discovered the blue superpower, we call it the protector, well, this is the second spike. This is the need to be calm and to comfort ourselves. And for the ones who are saying green, the expert, and you have received the green superpower cape, this is the need to be sensible and smart and informed in these times of fake news, like Helena was saying earlier, right? And misinformation. But you might say that it's tough to see differences when we look at a global level. This is why we have analyzed specific markets. Let's see. Again, we look at United States, the UK, China, and Brazil, and we see the same 3 needs spiking out, both in 2020 and in 2023, to stay optimistic, to be calm, and to stay sensible. Of course, there are regional differences. We see in China and Brazil a stronger growth on the needs for excitement and empowerment in 2023. So, of course, there is a need to bounce back and to take power over our lives again. But we will talk today about the 3 common areas: the need to stay optimistic, calm, and sensible. And in the meantime, I'll be checking the chat and the Q&A to see what are the colors of the people in the audience here. What is it that you put in? What is your superpower of resilience? Let's start with the first one. You see here the yellow superpower territory, being optimistic. Optimism is what makes us human. And in a world dominated by algorithms, it is emotions and empathy that keep us grounded. We're starting to talk about the human as premium label for brands, which give greater influence to that human touch, to that empathy that exists outside of automated habits or outside of an algorithm. What keeps us optimistic, what makes us human, are first and foremost our relationships. Look at the drivers of the happiest countries in the world. This is according to the Ipsos Happiness Index 2023, yeah? Out of 30 aspects of life, we have these top 6, and 5 of the top 6 pertain to relationships. Oh, and you might be happy to know that the global scores are increasing. On average, nearly 3 in 4 adults across all 32 markets that we have investigated describe themselves as happy. And of course, because we are talking business here, I do have to mention that time and time again, we see businesses with deep human understanding winning by connecting us with what and who matters most. I will give you an example which will not be a surprise to anyone, a bit paradoxical, but not a surprise. What it means to be human in Barbie the movie, Warner Brothers' highest grossing movie ever. From Barbie the standard beauty to Barbie the deeply human with cellulite and heels on the ground and patriarchy and all, it has given us a good ride on what it means to be human in the world today. I hope your appetite is high to see the other 2 strongest needs around the world, and also the 2023 icon brands that play them out. Let's go to the second global spike. And if you remember, that was the need to stay calm. Nearly half of the people globally still feel socially deprived, even if we're not in forced isolation anymore. This shows an emergency of loneliness. Just like Helena said, we have a mental health emergency. And the new solutions to social deprivation come from those brands that are able to turn alone moments into experiential intimacy, to generate that mental comfort and calm. The brand that I will share with you as icon of riding this trend is actually a persona brand, the #1 content creator on TikTok. He has 162 million followers. I bet most of you know who I'm talking about. Yep, it's Kabila Me, the Senegalese Italian who has turned this quality of being an everyman, really, into a universal appeal. Millions of followers are watching Kabila Me for hours a day while he does not say a word. He's silent. This is what we call a comfort creator. His streams have the ability to generate that feeling of calm and authenticity. And you can see the shift when you look at him, from that aesthetically driven Instagram influencer to this low-key comfort creator. It's getting better, isn't it? Let's move to the last fundamental human need that we will see spiking. And this is the need to play it sensible and smart. And you've seen it as relevant in 2022 when we were all under fake news and information and misinformation, and we see it playing today too. In a world that seems to show a vacuum of values, people are called to simplify their choices, to automate their lives, to get a grip really on life. That need to outsmart others, to outsmart the system, to be competent, to know better. And one of the expressions of this need is the decline of mainstream media. Our data shows that people are avoiding the news, which makes us wonder, if people are avoiding the news, how are we getting our information? And this is how we will close today. We cannot close without the sensation of the year, of course, ChatGPT with its skyrocketing adoption, which makes us all smarter and more sensible in less time, right? However, we do have to keep in mind that the adoption of generative AI is not a monolith. It doesn't happen in the same measure everywhere in the same time, but it follows the same wheel of privilege that Simon was mentioning when we were talking about working from home versus working from your employer's workplace. It's important for brands and businesses to also be sensible and to get intimate with the AI anxieties of your target, because we know that more than a third of the world's population are worried about how generative AI is going to replace their job. We need to be mindful of that before designing our AI-powered solution dedicated to our audience. And with this, I leave you hopefully with 3 strategies to navigate the anxiety of our consumers, and I'll take a look at the chat to see the colors that you put there. The conclusion really is, yes, we are living troubled times, but it's not actually an emotional roller coaster. The deep needs are quite stable. What changes is their expressions, the solutions that people find. This is what is different, and this is why we need to keep the finger on the pulse, because we want that deep human intelligence to simplify our business, really, to design great brand experiences and new products and great content. If we stay on the side of the human, if we keep that finger on the pulse, if we understand how these fundamental human needs express in the consumer culture now, we have our compass of action. And with this, Simon, over back to you.
Well, thank you for that, Tor, and we'll come back to you in a moment when you've had a look at some of the things that have come through on the chat. You'll be pleased to know, well, you may not be pleased to know, but I am a Brown empathizer, and I'm nurturing trust and deep human understanding, which is clearly the objective of this webinar.
You are, Simon, you are.
Thank you, sir. But before we go, we're going to go to Jack and Helena in a minute while you look at the results. But just one final piece of advice for you, though, for brands. Perhaps if I'm working on a brand, I'm looking for my own comfort creator. What's going to make me more comfortable? What should I take away if I could take away one thing from your advice?
What I would say, Simon, is in the culture of today, which is so much about being dynamic and changing and innovating, what will bring you comfort is to not underestimate the power of calm, the power of predictability. And Jack has told us about the need for order and structure, so I'll give it to Jack now. But from a fundamental human need, I do have to mention that we don't underestimate the power of habit and being predictable and keeping people calm by giving them comfortable solutions that they're familiar with.
Yeah, and that was something actually I think came through quite strongly, Helena, in your.
I think you're on mute, Simon.
Helena, in your work, Helena, that was something I think that came through in your work, because mental health was really continuing to stay very high on both when we do surveys and asking people about things, but also in seeing what's happening online, because we're still seeing very elevated levels of anxiety and concern about mental health, aren't we?
Yeah, actually, I have been studying this topic, mental health, for a few years, since 2019. And also, I'm studying this on social media specifically because it's my working area, and I have been following these changes in the way we've been talking about it. Here in Brazil, mental health used to be kind of a taboo, but we have noticed a movement, especially after the pandemic, of having mental health more as a topic of conversation on social networks, on influencer profiles, on TV, news, and even companies talking about it on their social media, and increasingly taking care of their employees' mental health. I was talking earlier, a few weeks ago, I was talking about mental health with some coworkers, and they all started saying, "Oh, I'm on antidepressives. I'm seeing a psychiatrist," and this is something that a few years ago was unthinkable. We weren't used to talk about so openly with coworkers, with friends, with family. So I truly believe that talking about mental health and violence and other topics that are taboo is essential, as the subject should not be a taboo. It needs to be discussed everywhere, especially online, because when people see information online, they gain awareness and they for more information on Google or etc.
Yeah, well, that leads us on to Jack, because Jack, you've got the privilege of looking at a lot of organisations and where their priorities are and where they're coming from, and have some of the things that Helena just shared with us about the rising concern and people's increasing willingness to talk about these topics. Are you seeing that when you're going into organisations and you're talking to the bosses about what they want to do and where they want to go?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. And it's one of the interesting things we see is, yes, the topic of employee well-being and mental health definitely comes up more and more in the research we're doing. I think what's quite interesting though is that are they genuinely becoming more of a problem for people, or actually is the idea of talking about poor well-being and talking about mental health becoming more acceptable, and therefore more people are willing to say, yes, actually, back to Helena's example, hands up, I'm struggling. So are we really experiencing more people genuinely having more problems, or just more people kind of willing to talk about those problems, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's one of those ones where, just from those of us on the research side, the data, we've now got it for a few years, but I think we're still trying to work through some of the patterns and some of the nuances in it. So, well, thank you for that. And as I mentioned, both Jack and Helena and Christina's presentations are all going to be available to everybody after the call. We've just got time to go back to Christina. Now, I think, hopefully I don't put you under too much pressure, Christina, but we've given you a moment to have a look at any of the themes coming out of what colleagues on the call have been saying. Anything that's struck you from your quick look at what's been appearing on the screen?
Yeah, thank you, Simon. It's been a pleasure to see the Q&A. We have a lot of yellow indeed, which is connected to that need for optimism that I was sharing with you. And a lot of empathizers, which is the brown color. This is how we code it in Sensidium, which is probably not surprising, because I bet most of our audience is made out of people who are in constant contact with consumers, right? Consumer centricity is an important part of the entire insights industry. So then maybe this is making us cluster more on that part of the wheel where we talk about connecting with people, about empathizing and networking.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as everyone on the call will know, we're all about representative samples, but I think we probably know that our clients on this call may be not quite absolutely representative of the population at last. But thank you, Christina, for giving us that panorama, and much more we can look into on those topics. So really, that's all we've got time for. Thank you, everybody, for being with us today. We are going to be back with you very soon, relatively soon, just over a month from now, when we're going to be looking at the year just gone or just going. We're going to be thinking about what we learned along the way. A number of our speakers have talked about generative AI. I think we need to have a little bit of a look at that. We're going to look at communications, building on actually some of the things we heard today as well. And we're also going to be having a presentation on China and a review of the year from there. So I do hope you can join us in a little over a month's time at our year in review. But for now, thank you for being with us. Thank you for the team for putting those presentations together. And we look forward to seeing you again very soon. All the best.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.